Hey guys, less is more back with another video, and today we're going to be mixing things up. Um, if you've been following this channel for a while, you might know that the vast majority of my content is pretty heavily grounded in theory, and using solvers, things like that. Uh, it's just how I came up in poker, and generally, I feel that uh, using theory as a foundation is the most efficient and best served long-term way to get better at poker. Um, but today we're going to be changing things up a little bit. We're going to be talking about some exploitative fundamentals. You might all be aware of a lot of the more popular tools used in exploitative study, which are, database analysis, pool analysis, MDA, things like that. Um, but there are high level tools you can use on top of that uh, to, you know, to hone in your exploitative game as well. Um, and we will, on that front, we will also be sticking with solvers. But there are some creative ways you can use solvers to get better at deploying exploits. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. So it's important to remember that anytime we're using a solver to study, we are studying an abstraction of the game. Um, the, like in between all of these different bet sizes we have available, there are nearly an infinite number of bet sizes we could face, and on top of that, different strategies uh, within these betting options. Um, so some players um, might only use a half pot bet size, but a somewhat congruent, um, polar strategy as what a pot size betting strategy might look like. Um, but the reason we study the response against a half pot size bet, even though our opponent might be using a slightly more polar strategy, is because if we study the theoretical response against a half pot size bet, we are deploying the mini max strategy against that bet size, just meaning that um, we are minimizing the maximum expectation they can yield from using that bet size. So basically, they just can't win more by using a specific bet size if we respond in a theoretically sound way. Um, However, it does not mean that that is the highest EV strategy, right? Um, so, uh, the point being, just remember this is an abstraction of the game, and certainly not, uh, you know, exactly what your opponent is doing in game. Um, so, like generally the size of our deviation should scale in relevance to like the strength of our read. Um, but today the spot we're going to be talking about is probing turns and rivers, uh, and it, it's really just a way it's a relatively simple node, um, but I just want to demonstrate a few ways to use solvers in your exploitative study, and this is a good way to do it. Um, so here we're using low rake sims. These are 2KNL rake sims. So what you might notice is, so here the big blind's much wider at 2KNL rake. A lot of these low hands getting in there. a lot of offsuit stuff, low suited stuff. The vast majority is suited hands. So what you'll see is, if you looked at this board at like 200 NL rake or 500 NL rake, well, here I have similar board pulled up, but this is, just as an example, this is King Jack 8 two-tone at 500 NL rake, and you'll see like this small size just really dips out. Basically, the wider the big blind is, the utility of this, the tighter the big blind, the utility of this small bet just goes away. Just because the high cards in our range don't benefit nearly as much from betting because they're not folding as much as they would at lower rake because they're tighter. So, against this quarter pot bet at 500 NL, the big blind's folding 29.6. Here against the quarter pot size bet, the big blind's folding, basically 1% more, which in context is, it's definitely not negligible. Yeah, just as an example. But yeah, let's hop into this. So we'll look at a couple different textures, but we'll start with this high wet two-tone double Broadway board first. So what you may notice is if you play low to mid stakes, even a board as high and wet as this one, players are still going to be c-betting this board way too often, just because a lot of players have tried to simplify their strategy to just a lot of high frequency betting on earlier streets, just because, like, with the justification that people respond poorly, which is generally true, but it does leave some small holes, and especially with weaker regs that try to do this, it certainly leaves some holes in their strategy across different board types, because they might range bet a board like this, which even at low rake is incorrect, but across other textures like Queen 10-7 or Queen 9-6 or something, they'll start to mix in checks, but they're so understudied in the flop check back line that because of their high frequency c-betting strategy, that they're just playing the delay nodes in a very weak way. So we'll start off with a board like this and talk about turn probes. So a big reason that players at low to mid stakes are playing these delay lines so poorly is because they, if they are generally c-betting the flop at a pretty high frequency across most boards, they, on boards where they are going to mix in checks, they're just not, basically their bets are constructed in a very polar way, and much more polar than they should be. So this board would be a good example where, some regs that are range betting on a lot of boards might mix in checks on this board, but they're still betting way too often, and so when they do check, their checking range is going to be way too much air. So for instance, they're going to be betting like a shitty king way too often, whereas they're going to be checking back like ace 5 off or ace 4 off too often, or checking back 8-5 too often. So when they do check back, it's not nearly enough top pair or middle or good middle pairs or something, It's just going to be way too much air. A lot of players at low to mid stakes are missing a lot of flop bets with, these sorts of hands, queen three, um, especially these low cards. Um, so the checking range generally going to be too weak, especially on a board like this. So what I'm going to do is just subtree this for the turn, and then, um, well, first we'll look at the GTO turn probe strategy across several turns and talk about that for a second. But then I'm going to subtree this and then manipulate imposition's range a little bit, and then we'll talk about the results. So first, talk about the turn probes. So generally on a really wet double Broadway board like this, where the out of position player is at a nut disadvantage per se, um, the out of position player is going to be probing in a very polar way on bricks. Um, it's going to be pretty polar across most turns, but obviously there will be uh, some differences across like draw completing turns. Um, so notice this default turn probe size is 2x pot, which is generally what you'd see on a board like this. And it's centered around like, you know, king 8 plus is kind of the threshold here. Um, basically a king that can outdraw uh, the king 7. But we'll, yeah, so, um, yeah, on these lower bricks, using a pretty low frequency polar turn probe strategy. And then as the turn cards get higher, or spades come in or something, you'll see a much less polar strategy. On like a queen or something. This is a card that's brings in lots of two pairs and straights. So we're not like, if we have king jack on this turn, we no longer have a hand that wants to put a lot of money in. Whereas on a deuce, imposition is going to be betting the majority of their better king x on the flop. So then, if you have king jack or king 10, you have a really strong hand. It's able to put quite a bit of money into the pot. I mean, these equities are just extremely high. Now, it's a bit different if, right, like if you get like the 6 of hearts or something. Well, now if you have king jack or king 10, the EV of putting a bunch of chips in the middle goes way down. We still have quite a strong hand, but you have to take notice of the fact that some straights come in, and it's a double flush draw board. So that means their continues are going to have significantly more equity when you bet big. Because like on a deuce, we can like get two pretty big bets in with something like king jack or king queen. But on a 6 of hearts turn, there are so many equity shifting rivers that we don't really want to blow up the pot here. We want to get like two medium-sized bets in, depending on the run out. And then yeah, as the turn card gets higher, like a high card turn is going to be better for imposition. So it's a spot where we don't need to be doing a lot of the big betting ourselves, because we can just check and then let imposition bet for us with a range that improved on this turn. Yeah. So like our nutted hands, instead of betting very big, we can just check to check raise. Not to mention that we're just at a very significant nut disadvantage here, because we don't have ace queen, and we're pure 3 betting 9-8 pre, so we don't have any straights. So, it's going to be a spot where imposition is going to be able to blast off on brick runouts. Yeah, imposition. If imposition has a straight, they're betting 4 times the pot on the river. If there was an all-in option, it would probably use that because of the strict not advantage for imposition. Okay, so now let's subtree this, and I'll get back to you guys. Okay, so I reran this turn. basically all I did is I took out some of the weaker king X for imposition. So basically where imposition is going to be c-betting flop a bit too often with top pair, and then checking back a bit more of this ace high air and this low card air, like the low cards without a flush draw. So now on a real brick like this, you'll notice that. So I gave slightly different sizes in this tree. I have, pot 150, 225. But what you'll notice is, well, let's look at this original strategy. So this was in the GTO sim. Very little betting for less than twice the pot, and it's basically just like king 9 plus is the value threshold there. But this weaker king X, not really betting. And the air we do use to bluff is really just going to be flush draws and this turn bottom pair. We can discuss later why this bottom pair is getting in there on a board like this. But you might want to do some investigation for yourself. But now on this board, you might notice that the frequency of these very big bets. So notice like 3 times the pot is getting in there. So the idea here is just that whenever imposition checks back or doesn't check back enough top pair, well, now these hands are extremely nutted. Like they turn less 2 pair on the deuce, right? So these hands can go for some thicker value. So on a turn like this, instead of using just that 1-2x pot strategy, well, now you could implement like a, maybe like a small overbet and a big overbet. Small overbet to, incorporate these weaker king X, because imposition is not checking back enough top pair. So now we're able to get more value with these hands, because imposition is going to be more condensed to air and like 10x, 7x pocket pairs, like under pairs to the king, things like that. So these hands are just worth more money. So 150 call, low brick, and now we're still able to pot the river with this king X, right? Let's see, in this sim, well, this is only pot, so probably going to be worth another bet on the river, yeah. But if we look at a hand like king 4, it's indifferent between like 2/3 pot and pot, so it'd be like a 75% bet would kind of be the chip threshold for these sorts of hands. So basically we're putting in around 22 big blinds in this line with something like king 4. Whereas in this line, we're able to get in something like 28 big blinds because our hand is that much stronger. Because imposition is checking back more caps, so they're going to have to defend more 10x than they would otherwise if they're checking back enough top pair. So you might also think, well, They're not going to call me down with a 10 enough or whatever, which, you know, is probably the case depending on your sizing scheme. But uh, well, if if that's the case, then it's okay. It's a this is why being so focused in game is so important, because in game, after you listen to this video, you might play a spot where imposition checks back a flop like this, and you do have a weak king, and you understand that uh, your king is now worth a lot more money because you suspect your opponent is not checking back enough top pair, um, or flush draws or whatever. Uh, so you have the king four of hearts, and it's pretty easy to spot that your hand is stronger, and you're gonna want to go for value more often. However, you know, it like your skepticism would be, okay, they're not gonna call me down enough. Well, then in another spot where like similar configuration, and you just have dust, like you have some marginal bluff like ace four of the spade or something, ace three of the spade. You you have to realize, like, okay, well, if I'm using that same logic to not deploy this deviation with the king four because they're not defending enough, well, then you're no longer indifferent with a lot of these bluffs. Like, especially if you have a deuce in your hand, or a hand really with any spade in it is going to at least be indifferent. You're like you're no longer indifferent, right? So it's important to uh, be focused in game, and like you just can't have it both ways. Either they're uh, defending optimally ish, or or you don't have a read, or whatever. But the other times where they're over defending or under defending a specific spot, well, whatever you're holding in your hand is no longer indifferent. Okay, so it's important to think about these things, and yeah, just make sure that your logic is being consistent, um, because lots of hand histories I review with students, it's like, well, he's not going to call me down thin enough when I go for like two big bets with something like king five or something. Well, okay, but then the next hand he shows me, it's like he's just checking down and losing when with nine high or whatever, which in theory on this board is correct, but you can't have it both ways. Um, so just make sure you're thinking through these exploitative spots in game, and you're not just um, you know trying to get you know trying to get some thin value, but then also just getting cold feet because you don't think they're defending enough. Like it can't be both. Um, yeah. So let's talk about some other textures, or other turns. Okay. Um, Flush completing turn here. Still a pretty low card. So in theory, or even on a flush turn, our turn probes are going to be relatively polar in theory. So for reference, this is the GTO sim. Optimal size somewhere between 3/4 and pot. So we'll just call it like 90% pot. And it's, king seven. Well, king seven's two pair, but king eight is kind of the indifferent hand here. But yeah, like the weaker king X down here, not betting nearly as often. because even though the imposition player checks back, um, the imposition player should retain their equity advantage on this board. Um, deuce would be the best example where the deuce doesn't improve either player very often, so the imposition player is still going to retain the vast majority of their equity. Um, so yeah, the only reason the imposition's equity dips so slightly um, after it goes check is just because um, they're going to be betting their nutted hands on the flop, but they should still have plenty of top pair that check back the flop, and hands that interact with this board in general. However, if imposition doesn't check back enough top pair, well, now our betting frequency goes from 74, or our checking frequency goes from 74 to 58-ish. So that's what, a 16% increase in betting, which is monstrous. It's massive. So what should that tell us? Well, basically tells us that so we're going to be sizing down slightly, although the sizing scheme on this flush completing turn really isn't that different. It's like slightly smaller is preferred, and then but that's just because I didn't manipulate the frequency that imposition is checking back hands with a spade in it. So imposition is going to be slightly more dense in flushes because their checkbacks are going to be more air and flushes. So we're sizing down a tad, or their checkbacks are going to be more air and flush draws, I should say. So on this draw completing turn, we're not trying to bomb it with a weak king, but imposition is much more capped. So we can go for value much more comfortably. So in this other sim, we're since imposition should retain the majority of their equity across turns, we're not thrilled about getting multiple bets in with these hands, especially because like when imposition has the equity, it retains their equity advantage, they're still going to be betting turn for you quite often. So you can check and let imposition do a lot of the betting for you, but the delay c-bet on a board like this in game is going to be bet not nearly enough. So it's just even a better reason to bet these hands. So now we can. So this is 2/3 pot. We'll get like a brick river. 2/3 pot, going for another 2/3 pot on the river. So we're getting about 10 big blinds into the pot here with a weak king, whereas here we're not even betting the turn very often with this low king X. So this should tell you like how drastic these exploits are, or like how many more big blinds you should feel comfortable getting into the pot, even though it's like a really dynamic flush board. We can, even on a really wet river like this, we can still get another small bet in on this river with a weak king. Yeah. But just the general principle of being able to get two chunky bets in with a weak king because your opponent's not checking back relatively strong hands enough. It's important to realize that. And again, like, if you think they're not going to defend less than top pair enough, well, suddenly that's going to change your strategy. So, yeah. Okay. Let's look at one more turn card. Okay, so remember that part of this subtree, I manipulated in position to check back a bit more of this ace high stuff and low card air. A bit more often than they should. So, it should not surprise you that the ace turn exploitatively is just not going to be as favorable for the out of position player. So we're going to be betting less often. And when we do bet with something like a low ace, we're just putting less blinds into the pot than we otherwise would. We're just letting in position do a lot of the betting for us. But in position is still going to be checking back quite a bit because on a board like this, in position isn't too incentivized to bet a weak ace here. Because remember, an ace doesn't need protection from an overcard. So on ace-x turns, you're going to see a lot of river delays getting used. That's just a function of an ace not needing as much protection, especially on a board where both players can have straights. So no one has like a nut advantage here per se. Yeah, so like here in game, obviously you want to figure out how your opponent's going to defend given the range you're assigning them, but if in position is going to turn a lot of top pair here, then you're going to want to be doing a lot of checking, especially if you suspect your opponent's going to bet an ace here a lot, which I suspect they will. Yeah, so if your opponent's going to be doing a lot of the betting for you, then you really don't have much incentive to bet. Just to demonstrate this, like if we lock in position to bet, we'll just say their betting frequency looks more like this, where they start to bet a lot of these weaker ace-x type things a lot more. Then, we're going to start to check a lot more. So we'll run this. Let's see. Yeah, so now we're just range checking turn. You think your opponent's going to be betting a lot of their ace-x like so, then, well, as the out of position player, we don't have much incentive to get bet into. A general principle, it's called the 50% rule, but basically if you suspect that you're going to get bet into more than 50% of the time, then you should just check your entire range. That's more of a turn and river theoretical idea, just because equities aren't running nearly as close on turns and rivers as opposed to the flop. And there's also the consideration of if they're betting very big, then you also wouldn't want to bet yourself because the imposition player is going to put a lot of money in for you. But yeah, that's the general idea here is impositions betting into you over half the time. So you you don't really have any incentive to bet. So yeah, just a couple theoretical ideas there. Let's take a look at a different board texture to end the video. So here's 6-5 deuce two-tone. You know, several things I see going on in game. I think a lot of players are betting good high cards too often. So, you know, like this high card stuff with a spade, I would strongly suspect, or even like a lot of this ace high, getting bet significantly more often than it should, or you know, like king 10 with a backdoor or something. These sorts of hands getting bet significantly more often than they should. You know, on these low boards, you know, if you have a good king or you know a middling ace or something, you're really incentivized to check back to keep, because like if you bet half pot here or something with like king jack, you're folding out a lot of this stuff you have dominated. You know, all this offsuit jack high stuff, suited jack high. So you know when you do have something like king jack or king queen or queen jack, you're really incentivized to check back and keep those hands in your opponent's range that you have rank dominated. So we'll look at a few turns here. So we'll just look at the hotness window here. So on high cards, you know, what you'll notice on low boards is blocks in the turn probe line are going to be much more frequent. And it really just has a lot to do with getting protection. So you know, if you have a 6 here, you're still relatively incentivized, like especially if you have a pair and a gutter or something, you're pretty incentivized to put in a small bet, and get protection from some overcards and fold out like a lot of this jack high 10 high trash, some queen high trash, and you also get called by a ton of worse hands. So something to consider. Now let's, well, we can look at a few lower turns. But you also notice like there's some very big overbets getting in here, and that's just because of the nut advantage. Because after like imposition can't have a straight anymore, and they're mostly going to be betting their sets. So you know you will want to have some overbets here, due to your nut advantage. You also have 6 deuce and 5 deuce in range that imposition doesn't have in this spot. So yeah, when you have a set, you have a massive nut advantage here. Yeah, so I'm going to manipulate this a little bit. So basically what I did here is, well, still have to build it. I basically just forced imposition to bet a little more often with overpairs, and then you know, bet the flop with more of this high card stuff with a spade in it. So that's sort of the idea here. Okay, so this is still running a bit, but so this is the 10 of the completed flush draw. So we discussed earlier that on these low flops, people are probably going to be betting a bit too often with stuff like these high cards with a spade in it. You know, like this king high stuff, queen high stuff, jack high stuff. and even some of this ace high stuff with a spade. So what that means for us is we can, because a big reason we do a lot less very large overbetting and such on flush completing turns is because equities run much closer on flush boards. Because if we bet very big, their continues are generally going to have a spade in them. So then, the expectation of how often we can get a bet in on the river with a non-flush hand is just a lot less. That's certainly still the case here, but remember that the imposition player isn't going to have as many spades in their hand as they should. So what does that mean for us? Well, that means that when we have a 10, we're not nearly as scared of, flush completing rivers. Because, yeah, if we get a spade river, we're not going to be betting king 10. But the probability that our hand goes to showdown and we win is a lot higher. And when we bet with something like king 10, it's much more likely that they have a board pair in their hand as opposed to just a high card draw with a spade in it. So then on a lot of rivers, we can now more comfortably value bet. Yeah, so that's sort of the idea here. So big takeaway here is, when your opponent's not going to have a spade in their hand as often as they should, we can bet bigger with our non-flush hands. So here's the GTO sim. You'll notice that we're either blocking or potting. And the vast majority of our 10x is just blocking, even a decent 10, right? Even ace 10 just doing a lot of blocking. But there's not many bets in those medium sizes. But now that imposition isn't going to have a lot of equity with a spade in their hand, the value of something like king 10 or ace 10 goes up. So these are just, these are all considerations that you should take into account. And there are lots of different textures you can apply these sorts of principles on, like straight boards or paired boards. But yeah, hope this helped a little bit. Yeah, just really want to hammer home this point I was talking about earlier about not being lazy and just because you don't have a sexy hand to deploy some sort of exploit with does not mean that your hand isn't different or is just a slam dunk give up or a slam dunk bet or whatever. You have to consider, like, if I had a different holding in this spot, would I go out of my way to make a significant deviation because I think my opponent is doing X, Y, or Z? It doesn't matter what you're holding. You have to take those considerations into account to figure out what your hand wants to do, right? Like, when we study solves, we're studying an abstraction of the game, and this expectation, this EV calculation here, all this is the aggregate EV of all the hands in our range. But in game, if we have some sort of read on someone, our expectation here should be significantly higher. And why is that? Well, so take this specific board we're looking at. If we have like Jack 7 or something, and we suspect our opponent is not going to be checking back over pairs enough, in addition to not having enough spades in their hand. Well, Jack 7 is just such a dusty hand, we might not use this one. Um, but if we have like 9-4, 9-3 that are much closer between betting and checking, well, now these hands, might yield an extra. Well, let's see, the difference between betting and checking here is like, might be, few big blinds per 100 or something. But if we had this read on someone and they're going to overfold 4 or 5% against a bet here, well, now you're yielding, um, an extra 10 or 15 big blinds per 100 easily. Um, so, uh, so then, the expectation of something like Jack 7 is going to be almost the same, just because we're checking to check fold, or bluffing the river or something, which is already factored into this specific EV calculation for Jack 7. But we're not making anything in this turn probe by betting. However, if we have 9-4 and 9-3, the expectation of these hands goes way up. So then this EV calculation would be much different, because we have the added expectation we yield with something like these hands added into this, whereas the other hands in our range may only slightly lose a tad. So all things to consider. But I hope this video helped, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. Again, please like and subscribe. That helps tremendously. I do want to get this channel a bit more into the mainstream, so yeah, all the publicity helps. But thank you guys for watching. Talk to you next time.